Hello, I'm Zena Iovino from Yle News, and we're coming to you from the Modern Art Museum Kiasma in central Helsinki. Welcome to our All Points North election special ahead of Sunday, when voters will shape Finland's direction for the next 4 years. We are joined by 4 guests: world politics professor Teivainen, populism expert Emilia Palonen, Bloomberg News Bureau Chief here in Helsinki, Kati Pohjanpalo, and of course Joel Willans of the Very Finnish Problems franchise. Thank you all so much for being here. We have a number of topics to discuss, but first up, I want to know quickly, what's your hot take on this? What do you believe is the biggest issue in this election? So let's start with you, Joel. You know all about Very Finnish Problems. In 30 seconds or less, if you had to choose one problem that Finland needs to address in this election, what would it be?
It's a great question, great question. I think well, for me, it would be certainly things like to do with like the climate crisis. And, you know, we're literally every day here in Finland, we're checking out the weather, and the weather is changing in a dramatic fashion. And, you know, from a global perspective, there's no getting away from it. So certainly that's something I would be looking at. But
you'd outlaw November.
I would outlaw practically the entire 6 months of winter. I know it's not practical, but I would, yeah, I mean, there are many issues when it comes to that that could be implemented, but also, you know, the cost of living crisis is something that people are more concerned with. So on a big scale, it would be climate crisis, but on a practical level, I know people are worried about the everyday costs of living.
And we will get to that very soon.
Okay.
What about Emilia?
Well, I think it's also going to be about these public services and the public debt. So these are the 2 big things discussed. So can we still afford to have the Finnish welfare state in the future?
Excellent question. Teivo?
I sort of agree that it's the economy Finland. So it's this public debt and how to finance things where, for example, one key question will be to what extent the Finns party economic policy has been moved close enough to National Coalition Party so that they can work it out together along the business-minded sort of lines of the traditional National Coalition Party thing. That will be a big question in governmental negotiations, I think.
What do you say, Kati?
People tend to vote with both their values and their wallets. And so my answer would be the economy. People will consider their basic values when they're selecting a party. Almost no voter will be choosing between the Greens and the Finns party, for example. But so that when you have the basic kind of feeling of who you're going to be maybe voting for, then you're looking at what they're saying about the economy.
Next up, let's talk about money. Rising prices and shrinking wallets are hitting people across Finland. Workers in many sectors are starting to see the pay rises they'll get this year thanks to new collective agreements. But at the same time, Finland's state borrowing rate has become a main theme in this election. The government took on 40 billion euros in debt to help deal with the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine. Our reporter Ronan Brown looked at how the country's aging population and sluggish economic growth are presenting Finland with some tough choices when it comes to providing the services typically associated with the welfare state. Let's have a look.
The rising cost of energy, spiraling inflation and interest rates, and Russia's war on Ukraine have driven Finland into a mild recession as election day approaches. This has led to a cost of living crisis, and each party has their own ideas on how to tackle it if they are elected into office.
We are very much focused on increasing employment levels and having more labor and employment for people. And we are also for lowering taxes, especially on labor income.
We are pursuing more strict migration policy, both in humanitarian sector and kind of low-skilled labor-based migration as well.
We don't have to be reactive, we need to be proactive, because further crises may emerge. We don't know about next winter in Europe, in the Nordics, in Finland.
Finland's economic experts are also split on how best to solve the cost of living crisis. Patricio Laine, chief economist with the trade union confederation STTK, believes that one priority should be raising wages in line with inflation.
Of course, after the Ukrainian war started, then inflation seemed to be on the rise for some time, and now wages haven't been following that, and that is basically the real wages went down last year about 5%, and this is like really historic.
Esi Eerola of the Bank of Finland meanwhile believes the next government will need to consider the options on a much longer term basis.
So if you think about energy prices, a lot has been done. To my taste, not all the measures have been very well tailored and targeted towards those that have been in greatest need. It will be important to think about, okay, how these measures should be implemented, and what is the need in terms of data and information that we need in order to make wise decisions in the future.
So there seem to be two camps at the moment, those who believe in economic growth and those who want to see cuts to state spending. Which will it be? Let's start with you, Kati. Is there a danger of cutting too much, or should Finland primarily focus on balancing the books?
I don't think you'll need to make the choice between economic growth and cutting spending. If you're raising taxes a lot, that tends to eat into economic growth and the prospects of it. But Finland is looking at fairly sluggish growth rates to begin with as a result of its aging population. The potential growth rate is about 1% a year. So that is not going to be enough to pay for the welfare state as it is currently without thinking about where to potentially cut some expenditure.
What's your reaction, Teivo?
Yeah, I sort of agree that it's not a choice between economic growth and cuts as such, but as we saw, there's some clear left-right differences there. Like from the right wing, it's more like lowering taxes, and from the left, it's like raising wages, which on the average for the wage earner could mean the same thing, but it's just to have more money for spending, which might reactivate the economy and which might be good for economic growth. But of course, it's targeted differently between the left and right. So.
The government's nearly reached its 75% employment target, which has been a major theme in Finland over the past few years. Is there still a pool of easily employable people out there, as some politicians like to suggest, when it comes to growth? Emilia.
Well, I do think that there is a lot of need to increase the population of Finland. We are only 5.5 million. And one of the biggest themes in these elections is whether there would be work-based migration into Finland or not. And as we have heard from the Finns party, they do want to be cutting down on any migration to Finland, whereas other parties would be very eager to have more migrants taking these jobs where there are no Finns or people living in Finland.
And we're going to get to migration in just a bit, but Emilia, where is the Finns party when it comes to state finances and economic policy? Are they on the left or on the right?
They are quite clearly on the right, and this has been a major shift from in their history. They used to be for the small people in Finland, in rural areas and also then in the suburbs, but they have streamlined themselves, and their intellectual-based leadership is very much focused on migration and right-wing economic policies.
Now, Teivo, you've talked about some left and right divides. Left-leaning parties generally are against cuts to social funding. Social Democratic Prime Minister Sanna Marin says the way to slash debt is through employment. But that's exactly what the National Coalition Party says as well. So I suppose my question is, are the main parties actually that far apart when it comes to the big issues, even though there's this idea that they are ideologically opposed?
Well, as Emilia pointed out, there's been closer contact in terms of economic policy between the Finnish party and the National Coalition Party, which is a global phenomenon. I was observing it in Brazil and in many other places. The more hardcore right-wing parties move towards the business right. But I think the Social Democrats and National Coalition Party have been careful in the fact that in electoral campaign they seem to be very far from each other on economic policy lines, but they make sure they have room for reconciliation when it comes to government coalition building. So I think they are closer than it seems.
They're closer than they appear to be.
Exactly.
The Ministry of Finance has published a list of suggested austerity measures for the next government to take, including tax increases and spending cuts. Is that going to be implemented, or is it just a suggestion? Who wants to take this one?
I would say the ministry, when they presented this list, intended it as something where governments can pick out elements. It wasn't intended as a full list to be implemented all at once. That would probably kill economic growth for years to come. But more like ideas and a really well thought out impact for them. What can you achieve when you pick out a particular measure on that list?
Someone said it was like a smorgasbord of bad tasting food where you have to choose some, but you're not supposed to eat all.
Well, cuts are never popular. You don't win votes by promising cuts in spending.
In this election, the parties seem to be talking less about a basic income model and more about removing welfare traps which discourage low-wage work. What's underlying this shift? Emilia?
Well, the current government has been needing to take a different stance than the previous government that was playing a lot with these basic income ideas. So they have proposed something else from a more social democratic background. But it doesn't mean that these kind of innovations could be resumed under a new government. So there is, of course, the need to get all the Finns to the labour market to the extent that is possible, of course. And partly working on these proposals is important. And we have an important dimension of these elections is also youth and youth employment and youth in the society being active and getting out of this pandemic gap where they ended up staying at home and not becoming active part of society.
It could be that at some point basic income makes a resurgence because it has proponents from the left and from the right. So liberal right and liberal left are both sometimes proposing it, whereas mainstream social democrats and mainstream conservatives are normally against it.
The National Coalition Party says it wants to lower the total tax rate in Finland and cut regulation to drive business. They're also calling for cuts to public spending. How will that resonate with people, Joe?
I just think that's a very classic example of like trickle-down economics. I mean, you know, coming from the UK where we've had a Tory government in power for 13 years, it just doesn't, I don't think it seems to work. And I think it seems to me it's been discredited already. So I know it's a very typical sort of like trope from right-wing parties, but, you know, tax cuts are always popular with people who are earning lots of cash. So yeah, I'm sure it will do its job with the people who will always vote for Kokoomus anyway. But whether it has makes a great deal of difference to other people, I'm not entirely certain because it's so sort of predictable. There's nothing very revolutionary about that.
We're now diving into the issue of climate. Finland's commitment to carbon neutrality by 2035 has been a main goal of Sanna Marin. But what's happened to climate concerns in the past 4 years? Who wants to start?
I think in the current coalition, one clear issue has been that the Centre Party has become much more clearly like defending interests of landowners and property owners And that signified one of the biggest sort of divides within the government that expressing itself in many ways also.
Well, this is partly for the reason that Centre Party's support has been shrinking drastically during this time in government, and is 1/3 of what it was 8 years ago. So from this perspective, they had to profile themselves in some way in this government.
Haven't they historically always been a farmers' party, though? Isn't that their sort of core?
Yes, that's also it. They are trying to speak to their core voters in this, and peat has been a key issue in Finnish politics.
Yeah.
Kind of a marginary theme, maybe related to Irish politics or something.
But what's the sort of like electorate when it comes to peat? I mean, how many people are in peat? Do you know,
peat business.
Yeah, the peat business, yeah.
Well, Teivo, I don't know if you know.
It's more
better.
a symbolic issue for them.
Right,
The peat and forests are like, we don't let foreign green colonialism and European Union interventionism to come and touch our forests and our peatlands. So it's almost like an anti-colonial discourse sometimes, landowners against colonial green and environmental coalitions.
So Greens are seen as like a sort of like internationalist and...
Yeah, against the local landowner.
Right. Okay, that's interesting.
Well, let's take a look at this graphic from Yle's Election Compass, which you can check out in English at yle.fi/news. Well, we see there's a clear division among parties in regard to preserving forests to secure carbon sinks, and that's, of course, also related to peat. While the left-leaning parties remain committed to this goal, it seems that others are more cautious. Do climate concerns win votes?
Well, I think the Finnish party has been profiling, as you can see from this chart as well, quite clearly in the same territory that Teivo just explained that the Centre Party is, so that we can do whatever we like with our forests and our marshlands, etc.
The National Coalition Party, the Social Democrats, and Finns Party are all vying for their premiership. How much would Finland's climate policy change if the National Coalition Party and the Finns Party end up running the government for the next 4 years?
I mean, presumably they'd change their target, wouldn't they? I mean, currently it's 2035 carbon neutral, isn't it? So, I mean, I don't know what their policies are particularly for that, but I imagine they'd trash it straight away. I mean, based upon this graphic here and what we've heard from the Finns, is that a fair conclusion?
But then again, the National Coalition might not want to be seen so conservative in the eyes of the wider European public, for instance. They have a liberal and conservative wing in their party, and I think that they would be also interested in maintaining some climate responsibility measures.
Yeah, I'm quite surprised how high it is for them, actually. You know, based upon my perception of them. My perception was they were more like that. So I suppose it's a battle between both wings of the party.
Has the Finns Party... you go ahead.
Also here the differences between electoral talk and actual practice is not that great, because the current government, despite when it started, it was this will be the best government in terms of climate concerns in the world, and it hasn't necessarily been so.
And what does that say?
Talk is cheap, isn't it?
And what does that mean in terms of what you just said?
Well, it means that now, for example, the Centre Party has been able to limit the sort of climate aims of the current coalition. And perhaps in the same way, if we get the right-wing coalition, let's say between National Coalition Party and the Finns Party, the National Coalition Party, as Emilia said, would probably like to make it a little bit less radically anti-environmentalist, as the electoral discourse seems at the moment, especially for the Finns Party.
Does the Centre Party simply need to suggest it's the only one looking out for rural interests if it risks ending up in the opposition?
No, I think the Finnish Party has been also trying to make this claim, and from these results of the logging question is, of course, that a lot of National Coalition Party supporters also own land and do want to be burning wood in their ovens to save cash from the electricity bills.
Emilia, you've said the Finns Party is now on the illiberal radical right. Could you open that up for us?
Well, they have moved to liberal, like they have liberalized their economic policies. So in this sense, they would be there. But they are conservative national, populist national party. Currently, they do emphasize nationhood, unity of the Finns, the kind of this blue-white Finland, and they are heavily anti-migration. All of their policies ultimately are sort of targeted to this question of migration and how to limit that to Finland.
Do you think they've lost some of their base? I mean, you talk about they've gone more liberal in terms of their economic policy. Does that cost them votes, do you think?
Well, I'm not sure if all of these former supporters or current supporters of the Finns party have then found another party to vote for. So if they still are within the same boat, then the boat can go anywhere. Yeah. There's like no alternatives to this gang. Even if we do have a small populist party, the movement now as well, they are also quite business driven.
It's crazy there's no alternatives when Finland has such a wide plethora of political parties to choose from.
Well, there are, of course, differences, and there are like small parties emerging on the side of the Finns party. The blue-black movement, an openly racist and fascist party, has been accepted in the Finnish party register. And then there would be also these parties that are related to the COVID pandemic and also somehow like linked to Putinism and this kind of fringe media influence from the eastern side of our border.
Fantastic.
Isn't that great?
So many possibilities.
Now, a majority of politicians and think tanks in Finland say we need more foreign workers to boost the workforce and support state finances. We thought we'd take a different look at this topic and ask what life is like for the newcomers already here. Are they getting the jobs they want? If not, why would migrants choose to relocate to Finland? Let's take a look at this report.
The issue of work-based immigration has been very much in the spotlight in the run-up to this election, as Finland seeks to bridge the ratio dependency gap between the working age population and dependents.
We need migrants coming in. Finns are getting older and they are retiring and so on and so forth. That this is like very common also in Europe. But in Finland it's like a more acute problem at the moment.
Despite this need, many immigrant workers find it difficult to find employment in their chosen fields. Dipankar Mondal qualified as a biomedical engineer from a Finnish university, but says many immigrants face significant challenges.
I don't know what happened after graduating, why I am not getting the job, why we are not getting the job, those people who have studied here. I know a lot of people who have this even PhD degree, they are doing cleaning. People are saying language is the main barrier to getting job in Finland for international people. But from my perspective, from my experience, language is not the main barrier. The perspective towards international people is the main barrier.
A recent report by the Etla Economic Research Institute said Finland will need to triple its net migration every year over the coming decade in order to sustain the Finnish welfare state.
We disagree strongly with that idea. Of course, if we got migrants that are skilled and educated and come to work and integrate to the society and pay taxes, it would be okay. But unfortunately, we don't get that much of that migration.
Of course, we need more migration into this country, but we need more room for entrepreneurship, for risk-taking, for labor and employment on so many levels, and that's what we intend to achieve.
So next government will definitely have to continue, because we also have to work better with the Finnish companies, and even the companies and regions and cities have to do better in this.
And economists say a failure to find a solution to this problem will put further strain on the Finnish economy.
But of course, if we are not able to attract foreigners, say, it will mean going forward that, we already see some of the effects of the aging population and the stress it puts on public finances and public expenditure, and that will continue to go forward, of course.
I'm interested in your reaction to this report. Let's start with Joel. Is it a winning lottery ticket to live in Finland?
I mean, that's open to debate. Of course, it depends where you're from, isn't it, originally? So, I mean, I always find this a fascinating question, but it's always like, you know, certain political parties think that it's going to be flooded with immigrants coming in because they're desperate to come to the happiest country on earth. And the fact is, like, you know, I've worked with Business Finland, talking about what it's like to be, you know, a foreigner here and trying to attract foreigners here. And there's huge competition. I mean, when you look at the sort of international rankings, Finland is way down there when it comes to places that people want to come to work and live. So the idea that there's going to be floods of people wanting to live here, I think, is just totally unrealistic. In terms of like living, I mean, I've been here for many years. I love living here. I didn't come here on, with the aim of moving here. I came here because I met a Finnish lady in London. So, and she brought me here after we lived together in the UK. But in terms of like, people wanting to be here and having a life here, I think there's many, many things that, are worth considering. But the fact that there's so many other countries in the world looking to recruit these people is going to be a challenge.
Well, a Helsinki city population researcher actually told me that the idea that there are thousands of immigrants just waiting to come to Finland is a fantasy often flouted by politicians. And as you said, there's a lot of competition. What's your reaction, Teivo?
Well, as we saw in the video, this can be the biggest issue dividing the National Coalition Party and the Finns Party, where they are so clearly apart. And then one could, on the one hand, argue that the Finns Party here has the most long-term vision with their scenarios that can be seen as fantasies, of course, but of sort of radical transformation of ethnic composition of Finland, and that being a long-term threat. And they are emphasizing that perhaps even more than before. And this will be a tricky issue when other parties talk about the middle-term need for, more population, more workforce, and all that. Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned the Finns party, and if we look at, here's another question from Yle's Election Compass, this time asking if companies should be allowed to hire freely. Now we're talking about the Finns party, and here we see that the Finns party is the most strongly opposed to companies having the freedom to hire who they like. We've seen them and left-wing parties at opposite ends of the spectrum on some issues, but here they're bunched together. Why is that?
Well, on the left, it's a little bit like traditional trade union kind of interests, and on the right, it's more like racist-leaning ideas of these future ethnic composition in Finland. But so that will be a tough one for the National Coalition Party to negotiate either with the left or with the Finns party.
What interests me here is the fact that it's inside the EU, which, the Finns party, I don't know what they're, by definition, they're nationalists, so they want jobs for Finns, but they're still talking about inside the EU rather than out. So they're still presumably still willing to have people from inside the EU. So it'd be interesting to see if that question was phrased differently to like inside Finland, how they.
It's kind of code word for non-white migrants.
That was what I was thinking, yeah.
Would you, Emilia, say that the Finns party, they haven't budged from their trademark anti-immigrant position?
No, they haven't budged. So they are very much highlighting this, and there is this implicit idea that the people who are coming from somewhere else are of like a lower quality than the ones who are already living here in Finland, as you could see in Riikka Purra's statements. So if they would be on certain level, then they would be accepted if they integrate. But this outside EU question here, of course, is one of the key. But I'm pretty sure that they would be also slightly suspicious of migration from within the EU, whereas this question, of course, for the left is read in a different way. The first part is emphasized.
Kati, how will Finland manage to care for its aging population and address labor shortages in the care sector if Finland doesn't manage to attract foreign workers?
Well, no one wants to come here to prop up the welfare state. That is not the idea of anybody considering moving to Finland. And so we're looking at the problem completely the wrong way around. We should be thinking in Finland of what we can offer people to have them come here, how we can make it easier for them to come here, if that is what we want them to do. And there aren't enough young people in Finland. The age cohorts are way too small to actually care for all of the aging people, or otherwise we'll have to lower our standards of care.
But then I also think that the Finns Party's message is mirrored on what's been happening in Sweden. So the segregation levels in Sweden, and the ways in which migrants have been part of Swedish society only in the margins, is something that is being addressed. So I do think there is a point of looking at the burning cars in Sweden and trying to avoid those mistakes. So when eventually people would be moving to Finland, they would be taken as fully appreciated citizens of the state.
But how do the Finns Party see? I mean, clearly I presume they accept there's an ageing population, because they seem to deny a lot of fact-based reality. But are they accepting there's an ageing population? And if so, what is their answer to helping the population become young? Is it more babies? Is that
one answer I think was given by the historian Teemu Keskisarja, who said in some debate, okay, let the families take care of the elderly.
Right, okay, so it's...
He's running in a Finnish party list.
Yes, exactly.
But then there is the other issue of not really wanting to deal with the practicalities of that question and looking at the voter base, who would be lower income, nurses and others who don't want to have too much competition either in their workplace with these newcomers who might not be able to speak Finnish in the way that they would be. So they are playing with this, the migrant is a threat for those services that are being provided currently with lower staff rates. Whereas the National Coalition thinks that if we have more hands in Finland, then things would be smoother anyway. But the question of how do you import labor in the first place? Is it possible? And what does it do to the existing structures and workplaces? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, the migration's a threat thing is just so sort of obnoxious, isn't it? And I always seen that, and when elections come, it always really comes to the fore. And the idea that immigrants are lumped together as one collective. I mean, and the idea that I've been here for nearly 20 years, and the fact that the idea that I'm somehow a burden upon society, despite the fact I've never ever taken any sort of form of benefits other than ones like health and stuff, and the fact I've been a huge taxpayer, I've had children, I've done all these things, but nonetheless I'm collectively lumped as someone who's not contributing to Finnish society is offensive. And also that, the idea of trying to get immigration when you have a party like that in government, no one wants to come and live here when the party that's in power is telling everyone, oh, why are these people coming here? They're a threat, look what they're doing to our society.
Yeah.
So there's this weird sort of the idea that this clearly seems to be the case that you need to have more people coming here. It seems to be a fact that everyone accepts. But, you're stopping that happening in many different levels.
It's actually interesting also in the last election 4 years ago, the two issues that were electorally very important were on the one hand migration, but focused on sort of violence and the typical Finns Party kind of discourse. And on the other hand, elderly care, that there were some scandals and arguably Social Democrats won because, they were able to say that against the National Coalition Party, they provide more possibilities for elderly care. But these issues were perhaps not mixed together, joined together as much as they might be now, at least in the future in Finland, like migration and elderly care. So migration as a workforce is becoming a more important issue electorally also in Finland more than ever before.
Yeah, now the question is about schools and how schools are thriving, and also in these multi-ethnic areas. This has been much debated, and there are these fantasy structures of multi-ethnic schools traveling in different parts of Finland that are mono-ethnic predominantly. So this is the discursive power of the Finnish Party. But there's also this idea that they emphasize a lot, which is reputation and limited reputation. So the question is whether the National Coalition would be willing to see the Finns party in government as a coalition partner if they are also like a limited reputation in the ways that you just explained, that nobody would want to come to Finland if there is a sort of far-right populist nationalist party in government.
In some sense, for parties like National Coalition Party in the world, it's sometimes the choice, like between looking at the far right and thinking, oh, I don't like their racism and their homophobia and anti-feminist because I'm a liberal, business-oriented right-winger, right? So, but then there's the left and I don't like their economic policies. And then the choice where the National Coalition Party kind of parties become kingmakers. And maybe they go like, okay, this is bad for my reputation, but I'll go with these guys because I like their economic policy, even though I don't like their other issues. And it harms my reputation as a liberal, business-oriented person.
And this might be then mainstreaming this kind of white supremacy ideas.
Well, that's exactly what's happened in the UK. To the British Conservative Party, where they've just taken UKIP ideas, and now we see the Stop the Boats, and the idea that the UK's been invaded by loads of immigrants when, on a global scale, it's minuscule, and also the fact it's a very successful multicultural society. But do you think then, in that sense, if you had to call it, do you think they would be more inclined to get rid of their reputation for liberal values and go with base of Finn's party or SDP?
I think we can see this after the elections, and we have to remember that Finland is a country for coalition governments. So who are the other partners that they could be convincing in government?
I mean, because looking at this, I mean, you've got two absolute ends of the extreme in terms of Kokoomus and the Finn's party here, haven't we? So there would be unlikely bedfellows, you'd think.
But that's one of the few issues where that is the case.
Yeah.
Now, we can't let you go without commenting on the major change in Finnish security policy since the last election. There is now overwhelming support for NATO membership, when that has previously been a minority position. There are some small disagreements, though, visible in the election compass. The discussion seems to have shifted to the practicalities of the alliance, like the sighting of nuclear weapons on Finnish soil. The left alliance seems to not want a NATO base. Teivo, Kati, it's a huge shift since the last election. What's happened here?
Well, you have to look at what's happening if and when Finland joins NATO. That doubles the eastern flank of the alliance. There is no way NATO will leave Finland to defend that alone. And if you look at how it's placed troops in all of the other eastern flank countries, there are allied troops in all of them. So whether that takes the form of a permanent base or not is kind of beside the point. NATO will strongly be present in Finland when membership becomes reality.
Yeah, for the left alliance, the only party actually having a clear stance against permanent bases and nuclear weapons. It's also playing to their internal audience. The party was divided so strongly in the decision about NATO membership that now it's also a little bit healing process inside the party. And this is one issue that sort of unites both who are still against NATO membership and who are for NATO membership. They can show they at least agree on something which keeps unity of the party.
But isn't it a bit naive to think as you were saying, isn't it a bit naive to think there won't be like a presence? I mean, by virtue of joining NATO, then it's almost it's inevitable that there will be.
But some of these things would demand legal changes in Finland. So in some sense, the Left Alliance people are saying that we hold to what the current law in Finland says about presence of foreign arms and nuclear arms and
Emilia.
bases.
Yeah, there's been a strong consensus on non-nuclear Finland in the past, but now all the parties were in agreement with the NATO membership, but when in this next door building, the Finnish parliament, they were voting on this issue, the only group that was divided into half on this was the only group where there were dissenting voices to this consensual view actually was the Left Alliance. And this is what is then mirrored also here. But 1 year ago when I was presented the survey results of like what does the Finnish population think about NATO membership, it was important for me to see that the Left Alliance supporters were also predominantly for NATO membership. So there might be a difference between also the politicians for the Left Alliance and then the supporters of the party views.
And like with other parties, including National Coalition Party and the Left Alliance, that are actually the partners where both sides have been saying, we don't want to go with them, but they have both have wings that might be willing to collaborate also in government. So the internal differences are big.
So who gets into the House matters.
Yeah.
And that's about all we have time for today. I want to extend a big thank you to our panelists and to you, our viewers, for joining us. Remember, you can get to know the candidates, the parties, and what they stand for by making use of Yle's Election Compass, which is also available in English, so do check it out. And of course, we'll be covering the election itself at yle.fi/news, bringing you the results as they happen on Sunday. And of course, check out our election results special edition podcast on Monday. Thanks again for joining us, and goodbye.